Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. 93, and welcome. After my first vlog in this series was posted, I received a comment from what I can only assume is pronounced Orved, or Orvt. Thanks for your post, dude. You post some good questions about the aeons. The first of these was how come some say it's the Aeon of Mat, and how can that overlap with the Aeon of Horus? So I've decided to do a sort of part 3 to the original 2-part episode I did on the astrological ages, and hopefully I can demonstrate, as far as my understanding, what are some fundamental differences between varying schools of Thelema. Firstly, it's best to point out that the aeons don't necessarily have a solid dividing line drawn in the sand. As far as I've stated in my past vlog, they have a sort of sphere of influence. They can be felt long before they arrive, and past eons can be felt long after they're gone. Astrologically, this is logical. Even though, right now, Aquarius is the dominant sun sign, it being February and all of the signs that surround it, follow in the year order, are still visible in the sky, no? This is a picture of Aquarius. The order along the ecliptic goes in the order of Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, etc. In this picture, we can clearly see that line. In the bottom right, we see Sagittarius just leaving. Right next to Aquarius, and dominating the entire lower right corner, is Capricornus. Naturally, centering and occupying most of the image is Aquarius. And though you can't really read it because this pic only got the last 2 letters, but Pisces is coming in from the upper left. So even though Aquarius is the dominant sign for this part of February, the other signs are still very prominent in the sky. I'm talking about all this because I suppose I'll always be a hermetic in the sense of as above, so below, and as below, so above. And though there is much debate about the eons and their influence in relation to time due to rituals and visions and the like that various people have had, which I will go into to some degree, the way I see it, if these eons have an effect on our way of life, and it's evident that the constellations have an effect on our way of life, and the ancients all over the globe have been talking about this similar concept since the beginning of humanity itself, then does it not stand to reason that the astrological ages and the eons that Crowley and others spoke of are synonymous? But anyway, now that we're done with the physical elements, let's look at the theory and theology behind this concept, specifically when it comes to the debate of the Aeon of Mat and the Aeon of Horus. It's my belief that Crowley was referring to phenomena that coincides with the astrological ages of antiquity. And when it comes to Thelema, for me it always comes back to the master theorion himself, the great beast 666, the prophet of the new Aeon, Mr. Crowley. So I would like to read a few passages from Crowley's work to support my theory. Firstly, from the Big Blue Magic, let's go in the camera there you go, the extended version of Book 4, all 4 parts. I'd like to go to page 702, where he speaks on the reception of the Book of the Law and its legitimacy in relation to the eons. Religious history has 2 main stages. In the first, men did not know that their intervention of the male was necessary in reproduction. Mut, the vulture, was worshipped as a symbol of the mother of the universe, because that bird was supposed to be fertilized by air. Mary, fertilized by the Holy Spirit, spiritus, breathing, Hebrew ruach, breath, air, mind, is another form of the legend. Man was supposed to be the child of the Mother Earth. We have a period of gracious, primitive paganism. It corresponds to the once born of the classification of William James. Presently, the medicine man, who combined priest and physician, discovered the secret of sex, and this was transmitted in certain mysteries of initiation. The priest was thus able to perform miracles on barren women. This was the chief source of his wealth and power. Note that the priest, to be effective, must be necessarily a heretic. His influence depends on his knowledge that the popular cult is nonsense. The mystery of sex became popularized. The cult of Isis gave way to that of the dying god. This was connected with the apparent death of the sun, daily and yearly. Legends of hanging, crucifixion, stabbing, etc. formed the popular mysteries, and the powers of the priests lay in the fact that they possessed an initiated interpretation of the fables, which the vulgar took for facts. But when it was discovered that except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit, depended for its truth on an heretical definition of death, and that the sun did not die, either at sunset or in autumn. The analogy with the resurrection of the body broke down. The power of the priests had depended on the argument, as by our magic we restore to you the dead corn, the dead vine, the dead son, so can we restore to you the dead husband or brother. We can arrange for you to meet him again in a glorified body, in a world free from sorrow. I have written as if priestcraft was wholly selfish and dishonest, but the book of the law, while not denying the facts, reconciles them with opposing view, that the priest is wise and benevolent, instructing ignorance little by little. The book presumes a conscious, providential direction in the course of spiritual evolution. It presumes the existence of a body of initiates pledged to watch over the welfare of mankind, and to communicate its own wisdom little by little in the measure of a man's capacity to receive it. The initiate is well aware that his instruction will be misinterpreted by malice, dishonesty, and stupidity, and not being omnipotent, he has to acquiesce in the perversion of his precepts. It is part of the game. Libra vel magi tells the magus, here defined as the initiate charged with the duty of communicating a new truth to mankind, what he may expect. There are many minor magical teachers, but in recorded history we have scarcely half a dozen magi, in the technical sense of the word. They may be recognized by the fact that their message may be formulated as a single word, which word must be such that it overturns all existing beliefs and codes. We may take as an instance the word of Buddha, anatta, absence of an atman, or soul, which laid its axe to the root of Hindu cosmology, theology, and psychology, and incidentally knocked away the foundation of the caste system, and indeed of all accepted morality. Muhammad, again with a single word, Allah, did the same with the polytheisms, patently pagan or camouflaged as Christian, of his period. Similarly, Aivas, uttering the word Thelema, with all its implications, now supersedes the formula of the dying god. Thelema implies not merely a new religion, but a new cosmology, a new philosophy, a new ethics. It coordinates the disconnected discoveries of science, from physics to psychology, into a coherent and consistent system. Its scope is so vast that it's impossible even to hint at the universality of its application. But the whole of my work, from the moment of its utterance, illustrates some phase of its potentiality, and the story of my life itself, from this time on, is no more than a record of my reactions to it. To recapitulate the historical basis of the Book of the Law, let me say that evolution within human memory shows three great steps. 1. The worship of the mother, continually breeding by her own virtue. 2. The worship of the son, reproducing himself by virtue of voluntary death and resurrection. And 3. The worship of the crowned and conquering child, the Aeon announced by Aivas and implied by his word, Thelema. Egyptian theology foresaw this progress of humanity and symbolized it in the triad of Isis, Osiris, Horus. The neophyte ceremony of the Golden Dawn prepared me for the new Aeon, for at the equinox, the officer who represented Horus in the west took the throne of Osiris in the east. Book of the Law is careful to indicate the nature of the formula implied by the assertion that the presiding officer of the temple, the earth, is Horus, the crowned and conquering child. And again, Egyptology and psychology help us to understand what is implied and what effect to expect in the world of thought and action. Horus avenged his father Osiris. We now know that the sun, indeed every element of nature, does not suffer death. We know that change, of which death is one case, is the first condition of life and consciousness. When we say that the sun has set, we know that what has really happened is that we've gone into the shadow of the gross planet on which we crawl. We know that given the sense competent to perceive it, light is everywhere, except where such gross body momentarily obstructs it. Nature is a manifestation of continuous and inexhaustible energy, and every apparent death of energy is simply a case of momentary interruption, like the darkness produced by the interference of two rays of light. The true symbol of the Godhead, by which we mean creative energy, is therefore neither the mother nor the man, but the child. The child is not merely a symbol of growth, but of complete moral independence and innocence. We may then expect the new Aeon to release mankind from its pretense of altruism, its obsession with fear, and its consciousness of sin. It will possess full consciousness of the purpose of its own existence. It will not be possible to persuade it that it should submit to incomprehensible standards. It will suffer from spasms of transitory passion. It will be absurdly sensitive to pain and suffer from meaningless terror. It will be utterly conscienceless, cruel, helpless, affectionate, and ambitious, without knowing why. It will be incapable of reason, yet at the same time intuitively aware of truth. I might go on indefinitely to enumerate the stigmata of child psychology, but the reader can do it equally for himself, and every idea that comes to him as characteristic of children will strike him as applicable to the events of history since 1904, from the Great War to Prohibition, and if he possesses any capacity for understanding the language of symbolism, he will be staggered by the adequacy and accuracy of the summary of the spirit of the new Aeon given in the Book of the Law. I may now point out that the reign of the crowned and conquering child is limited in time by the Book of the Law itself. We learn in chapter 3, verse 34, that Horus will be in his turn succeeded by Thelema, the double-wanded one, she who shall bring the candidate to full initiation. And though we know little of her peculiar characteristics, we know at least her name is Justice. We see in this section an almost synonymous reference between Mut, the vulture, and Isis, the mother. As well, Crowley firmly plants that the current Aeon is that of Horus, though they are subjects to the utterance of the word of the Aeon. As he said, every magi in history has uttered a word that has broken every paradigm that currently exists, which is subject to personal circumstance, but also states that Horus will be succeeded by Thelema. Let's look next at the passage from Libra Al that Crowley made reference to in the text I just read. Chapter 3, verse 34. But your holy place shall be untouched throughout the centuries, though with fire and sword it be burnt down and shattered. Yet an invisible house there standeth, and shall stand until the fall of the great equinox, when Hrumachus shall arise, and the double-wanded one assume my throne and place. Another prophet shall arise, and bring fresh fever from the skies. Another woman shall awake the lust and worship of the snake. Another soul of god and beast shall mingle in the globed priest. Another sacrifice shall stain the tomb. Another king shall reign, and blessing no longer be poured to the hawk-headed mystical lord. Crowley further elaborates on this in his extenuation of the Book of the Law, which is published as the new comment in Regardie's edition of the Laws for All. I'll put that up on the screen for you. Page 289. Humachus is the dawning sun. He therefore symbolizes any new course of events. The double-wanded one is Themaist, of dual form, as Themaeus and Themaet, from whom the Greeks derived their Themis, goddess of justice. The student may refer to Equinox, Volume 1, Number 2, page 244 to 261. Themaist is the hegemon, who bears a mitre-headed scepter. Like Joshua in the Royal Archdegree of Freemasonry, he is the third officer in rank in the neophyte ritual of the Golden Dawn, following Horus, as Horus follows Osiris. He can then assume the throne and place of the ruler of the temple when the equinox of Horus comes to an end. Now, let's get onto the Aeon of Maat concept for a second. I suppose the most important figure in this argument is Charles Stansfield Jones, or Frater Achad. Achad was the 20th person to be initiated into Crowley's AA. He was also an OTO initiate, and was the organizer behind the first lodge in North America, which was founded in British Columbia, here in Canada. Jones worked under Crowley for many years in the outer order of the AA. But it came to light during Jones's interactions with Crowley that he was in fact Crowley's magical child. Achad decided to take the oath of the Abyss, which would initiate him into the Magister Templi grade, therefore elevating Crowley to the grade of Magus, since Achad would be replacing Crowley's current position, therefore elevating him since he was his superior. Crowley took this as a revelation. For 9 months before Jones decided to take his oath, Crowley had performed a set of sex magic rituals with a woman that went by Sorer Hilarion, with no apparent success of conception. Crowley noticed the 9-month interval between his workings with Hilarion and Achad's birth as the babe of the Abyss, and proclaimed Jones to be his magical child, as prophesied in the Book of the Law. I refer you to chapter 1, verse 54 to 56. Change not as much as the style of a letter, for behold, thou, O prophet, shalt not behold all these mysteries hidden therein. The child of thy bowels, he shall behold them. Expect him not from the east, nor from the west, for from no expected house cometh that child. All words are sacred, and all prophets true, save only that they understand a little. Solve the first half of the equation, leave the second unattacked. But thou hast all in the clear light, and some, though not all, in the dark. We can see by this passage that Crowley's child will help him to reveal this work to the world. Also, we see again the idea of a word being sacred, and that all prophets have uttered that word, gives them their authority as magi. This leads us to where people are getting this whole Aeon of Maat concept from. When Frater Achad became the master of the temple, he uttered the word of the Aeon in, I believe, 1948, and as a result concluded that the Aeon of Maat had been kicked off and would run parallel with the Aeon of Horus. This comes from the concept of an apparent overlap due to the movement of time being seen as a spiral rather than a perfect linear sequence. and so the idea of a twin current was born. By this view, every aeon runs above and below the others at any given time. To me, this further supports the idea of the sphere of influence that the ages apparently have, and that all ages can be felt all the time. Obviously, Judaism was born in the age of Aries. Just because the age has long passed doesn't mean that Jews no longer exist. Paganism was obviously dominant during the age of Taurus. Just because that age has passed doesn't mean there's no more pagans in the world. The age of Pisces saw the growth of Christianity, and even though Christianity would dwindle in the coming age of Aquarius, doesn't mean there will no longer be any Christians. Of course they'll always be around. The Assyrian energy is still prominent in the world. But anyway, enough of my opinion, and back to the topic. This later fueled other writers and traditions, such as Kenneth Grant's Typhonian tradition, which would have us see Maat as the daughter, as would be analogous with the Tetragrammaton, father, mother, son, daughter. And because of this, she complements Horus rather than succeeds him, and the two god forms exist simultaneously as a double current. Grant also proposed 3 eons that predate the Aeon of Isis, which were the Aeon of the Void, the Aeon of Chaos, and the Aeon of the Earth. I admit, I've not read any of Grant's work, and so I don't presume to speak authoritatively on it. But I say again, when it comes to Thelema, my go-to guide is Uncle Al. So we can see, especially by the first section I read from Book 4, that Crowley saw the succession of the Aeons as parallel to the advancements of the officers in the Golden Dawn Neophyte Temple, as given in the Golden Dawn ceremony of the equinox. Crowley included a full equinox ritual in Genesis Libri Al, in his book The Equinox of the Gods. The officers of the Golden Dawn Neophyte Temple are listed as follows. I'll just leave that up there for a sec so you guys can take a look. But as you can clearly see, the Hierophant is Osiris, the Hieros is Horus, and the Hegemon, mindful of that word, is Maat. Aside from these, there's also invisible stations, which are not occupied by any human member, such as the elemental cherubs, referred to as the sons of Horus, and the evil triad, which is Apophis, Set Typhon, and Bes, as well as Hippocrates, is an invisible station as well. According to Crowley, in the Equinox of the Gods, these do not have to be represented by human officers, since they are existing within Horus. Therefore, Horus is not only seen as the twin forms of Horus and Hippocrates, but is also composed of the Set Apophis, the destroyer of Osiris. It is by destroying the idea of death that the twin gods will be born. By this order of officers, all that is required is that Isis be moved to the 3rd position, switching with Thoth to precede Osiris. The rest of the god forms can be ordered by referring to Crowley's Paris working. Having invoked Hermes as force, Crowley had a vision where he declared Hermes Thoth as the first of the aeons. Therefore, if we parallel the order of this order with the equinoctial precession, we get the following. As we see, the Aeon of Isis is synonymous with the Aeon of Aries, the Aeon of Osiris is synonymous with the Aeon of Pisces, and the Aeon of Horus, that with Aquarius. The Aeon of Maat won't be here until the Aeon of Capricorn is upon us. This parallel demonstrates more thoroughly the meaning of the Golden Dawn ritual in relation to the concept of the aeons, but don't forget to show a certain amount of flexibility with this concept. As I've stated, there are a rather large sphere of influence for these attributions. So our next step, I suppose, is to once again look at the astrological attributes of these signs and how they have affected human history. So I'm going to start at the beginning, with the Aeon of Thoth, being influenced by Gemini and Sagittarius. Gemini is the twins, therefore has a light and dark side. On the first side is representative of adaptability and versatility, as well as communication. On the darker side, it represents superficiality and inconsistency, as well as being cunning and inquisitive. We see in this age not only a birth of human conception of divinity, but also the birth of language and imagery, these being aspects of Thoth, the scribe, god of language and science, as well as astrology and magic. Sagittarius, being the autumnal influence, is represented by the centaur, half man and horse, with his bow and arrow pointed towards the heavens. This again alluding to a dual nature. It symbolizes humanity overcoming its animal nature and setting its aim towards the heavens. Sagittarius is also symbolic of adventure and philosophy, and extending beyond our immediate surroundings. Also very representative of this primordial period of human development. Next is the Aeon of Nephthys, ruled by Taurus and Scorpio, or affected by Taurus and Scorpio. Taurus is represented by a determined bull. Taurus is not specifically fast or clever, but is not distracted from its goal. It will not give up its sure footing, and will endure to a greener pasture. In this age, we saw the reverence of the bull as a representation of the phallic nature of deity. During this time, subordinate species were domesticated, and humans began to farm. As a result, we saw a much more comfortable time for humanity, and that we were becoming stronger and more determined to survive, and were less subject to nature and in more control of it. During this age, we also saw the birth of many fertility cults that were oriented around agriculture, such as the cult of Dionysus. The Scorpio influence shows also the recognizing of divinity in vegetation, and the aspect of Scorpio, and the third aspect of Scorpio, being that of the phoenix, shows the human race's ability to transcend our lust for possessive passions, and move on to a higher consciousness based on universal love, leading us into the Aeon of Isis, or that of Aries, also influenced by Libra. Aries represents courage and leadership qualities, hence why, during this age, we saw the birth of law codes, such as Hammurabi's Code, or even the commandments of Moses. Because of the courage of Aries, humans began to face their problems head-on, and overcome them with the formation of laws and ethics. Also during this period, we began to see the use of animal sacrifice, where flesh and blood became the center of worship and divinity. Libra is represented by the scales, the only sign that is an inanimate object. It shows a non-emotional need for balance. It is also why this age is the birth of scripture and recorded history, leading us on to the Aeon of Osiris, which is ruled by Pisces and Virgo. Now, I've discussed much already on the influence of Pisces on this age of human development. We can see strongly that this is a period of vicarious atonement. In other words, people began to get their enlightenment from the legends of others' attainments, such as Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, etc. The Virgo influence, represented by this sign, actually jives quite well with Pisces in the representation of Virgo as the Virgin, showing that the dominant religions of the time being reclusive from the world rather than embracing and studying it. Also, why the Virgin Mary is nearly as important in most Christian religions as Jesus himself. Finally, our current time frame the Aeon of Horus. Well, actually not finally, but the Aeon of Horus, Aquarius, and Leo. I've also discussed Aquarius's parallels with that of Horus, that of liberty, and a recognition of the individual as the basic unit of society. The Leo influence is that of the lion serpent, upon which our sacred lady Babylon rides. Leo is confident and ambitious, but also has the potential for vanity, which does sound quite a bit like our modern world to me. Now, the Aeon of Mat, or the Aeon of Capricorn, also influenced by Cancer. Capricorn is represented by the goat, which can climb to the highest peaks with bounding ease. The sign represents practicality and discipline, as well as patience and carefulness. Mat is the goddess of justice and law, order and truth of the highest sort, and in ancient Egypt was seen as the female aspect of Thoth. The hall I spoke of in my first episode, where Thoth weighs the heart of the deceased, is called the Hall of Mat. However, unlike the age of Isis or Aries that saw the birth of law codes, I feel that the Cancer influence on this period may lead to a time of adapting to changes that precede it in the Aeon of Horus. Just as the crab journeys with the tide, crabs live in the fastest changing environment on the planet, with a constant rising and falling of tides. But because of this, they also live in the most nutrient-rich environment. We can only speculate what actual physical historical events this age can bring. By this theory, it's so far in the future that it's hard to tell. But judging by these attributes, I'd like to believe it's going to be a time of awakening, even more so than our current Aeon. And humans will begin to come into their own and grow the fuck up as a race. So, by this conclusion, I think that the human race has a rough age ahead, as far as some growing pains that are obviously we have to go through. But what will succeed this inevitable time period is hopefully a time when our race will approach a state of absolute justice and truth. We're children, and it's up to us what kind of adult we become. I welcome the Aeon of Horus, and recognize that it will not last forever. Perhaps the Aeon of Mat is already being felt. I have no doubt of that. It's not unreasonable. We can see historical events that are technically in the Aeon of Osiris that are characteristic of the Aeon of Horus starting to be felt. The Renaissance, for example. My point is that the Aeon of Mat is a reality. Even Frater Achad commented in his later writings that he was perhaps premature in his revelation of the Aeon of Mat. So we will reach a stage of truth and justice. We've just got a journey to still travel before we get there. It just may not be a pretty one. It's nice, however, to have a hope for the future, especially when going through a rough patch. This brings to mind the famous American saying, liberty and justice for all. Love is the law. Love under will.